Hey everyone.
Hey guys.
Welcome to another Travel Therapy Mentor video. Tonight we're talking about understanding pay packages. We've got a lot of people that we've been helping get started with travel therapy. They're getting placed now. Been talking about the job market has improved a lot, and a lot of them have been asking us questions about how's the pay package broken down, trying to understand what the contract looks like, how it's written, things like tax pay versus untaxed pay. So we want to talk about all of those things today. As you guys probably know, we look over a lot of pay packages. That's a free service we offer to travelers. If they want to send us their pay package, we look over it, and so sometimes it can be confusing. Companies do things differently. Recruiters present pay differently. So we want to talk about all that tonight, hopefully give you guys some insights. We've got some pretty important announcements, cool announcements, some giveaways. So Whitney's going to introduce us and talk about those.
All right, hey everybody. My name is Whitney Aiken.
I'm Jared Kazaza.
And we are both traveling doctors of physical therapy. Many of you guys may know us as the faces behind the Travel Therapy Mentor page. I know a lot of you guys have tuned in for our videos in the past, but if it is your first time tuning in with us, welcome and thanks for joining us tonight. We try to do these videos every couple weeks, teaching you guys about different travel therapy topics. Now, we have talked about pay in the past, but we wanted to do an updated video on this, just breaking it down again for those of you guys that are newer to travel therapy. Like Jared said, we get a lot of questions about pay all the time. It can be quite confusing because travel therapy pay is a lot different than permanent therapist pay, whether it's like a salaried position or a PRN position. So we'll go over all the details and teach you guys about that tonight. If you are tuning in live, we would love if you'd say hello in the comments. I see a bunch of you guys are already on. If you're watching later during the replay, just type #replay in the comments. We would love to know who you guys are. Are you current therapists that are thinking about traveling? Are you students that are thinking about traveling? Are you experienced travel therapists? Are you already out in the traveling world? Let us know in the comments. As Jared mentioned, we do have a couple of announcements for our Travel Therapy Mentor business. We are doing a giveaway right now, which is super exciting, on our Instagram page. So if you're not following us on Instagram, we're on Instagram at Travel Therapy Mentor. And we're doing a huge giveaway right now. We are giving away 3 different prizes to 3 different winners this time. So normally in the past, we've only done 1 winner. So there will be a chance for 3 of you guys to win a prize. The first prize is a pair of Apple AirPods Pro, so a pair of pretty sweet headphones. The second and third place winners are going to win a combination prize. They're going to get a Yeti tumbler cup, as well as a white noise machine, which can be pretty sweet for traveling and blocking out some of that noise when you're traveling to a new place and sleeping at night. So go to our Instagram page at Travel Therapy Mentor. Make sure you're following us on there. See our most recent post where we tell you all the details on how you guys can enter to win. In addition to that, some of you guys may have seen over the past several months, we've advertised that we're doing an end of the year giveaway this year for the first time. And that giveaway is specifically for folks that have gotten recruiter recommendations from us and taken a travel therapy contract with one of our recommended recruiters. We've been able to help so many of you guys over the last several years to get connected with recruiters, help you guys get into some of your first travel therapy jobs. So, that's super exciting for us to be able to help you guys do that. And we wanted to give back to you guys who have reached out to us. So if you have taken a contract with one of our recommended recruiters, either in 2020 or in 2021, you are already eligible for this giveaway. All you have to do is just fill out the entry form and you'll be entered to win. We're going to be giving away, was it 3 or 4? I think 4 gift cards.
4 $250 gift cards.
Yeah, so a total of $1,000 in prizes at the end of the year. So 4 different therapists will get a $250 gift card at the end of the year. So if you have already gotten recruiter recommendations from us and taken a travel therapy contract with one of those recruiters, you can head over to our website at traveltherapymentor.com. The giveaway page should be at the top, or I know for sure if you click on the recruiter recommendations tab, there's a link to the giveaway form on there. If you have not completed a contract or gotten recruiter recommendations from us and you are interested in that, you can do the same thing. Go to our website, traveltherapymentor.com, click on recruiter recommendations at the top, fill out that form, we'll get you connected. And then, like I said, if you end up taking a contract with one of those recruiters, which already helps you out, then you're automatically entered to win. You are eligible to win the giveaway if you fill out the second form. So just a couple announcements about giveaways for you guys, but let's dive into tonight's topic. Real quick, hey to those of you that are on live. Hi Jake, hi Rachel, hi Joey, hi Nick, hi Ashley, hi Tyler, hi Daniel, hi Marcy, hey Brian. Nick says it's flooding where he is. That's no good. But yeah, for those of you guys that are tuning in live, let us know who you are in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. But let's dive into tonight's topic, understanding a travel therapy pay package.
Yeah, so the first thing to understand about travel therapy pay is that it is different, obviously, than a salaried or an hourly position at a permanent job. The reason for that being that probably 95+% of travelers travel with a tax home, which makes them eligible for tax-free stipends. So the pay is broken down into a taxable hourly rate and stipends, which are essentially reimbursements for things like lodging, meals, and incidentals. So you can't really compare apples to apples, a salary position or a hourly permanent position to a travel position. And that causes a lot of confusion for people, both people that are considering travel and they look at the pay rates and they're like, oh, it's not even worth it for me to travel. A lot of times they don't really understand how it's broken down and how the majority of your pay as a traveler is untaxed. So that's the first thing to understand, is that you can't really compare apples to apples to an hourly or a salary permanent position.
Yeah.
Pay is very different.
If all of this is new to you guys, it's really good to watch this video and learn from us, but it is also good. I'll link to a couple of articles that we've done in the past about travel therapy pay. I'll insert the link in the comments on the video after the video, because I think it's also good to look at this stuff broken down in Word format so you can better understand the calculations and how you add up a pay package. But that point about having to have a tax home, if you're brand new to travel therapy, please do your research on that. You don't automatically qualify for tax-free stipends. Again, the majority of therapists do, as long as you're meeting the tax home rules. And we're not going to go into great detail on that on tonight's video, but definitely check out our website where we have articles and other videos about tax homes to make sure first you qualify. And it is your responsibility to make sure you qualify, not your recruiters.
Yep. And so a common question we get is, what's an average travel PT or travel OT, travel therapist salary? Well, this question doesn't really make sense for travelers. Reason being, not all travelers work the same number of weeks per year, and not all travelers work the same number of hours per week. So you might have a contract where you work 32 hours per week and you only work 40 weeks per year. That's something that some travelers do. Or you might be the traveler that works 40 hours per week for 52 weeks a year. Obviously, those pay ranges are going to be massively different. So you can't really talk about it in terms of salary. The way you talk about travel pay is in terms of weekly take-home pay. And that's an easier way to understand, compare basically between companies and between recruiters, how pay is broken down. So that takes into account your taxable pay after taxes. And this obviously depends on your tax filing status, how you fill out your W-4, in addition to the stipends added onto that. And so those two numbers added together are your weekly take-home pay. And that's how most after-tax weekly take-home pay, that's how most recruiters and companies are going to refer to your pay. And when they quote you a number, that's usually what they're talking about.
Yep. So the very first thing to look for when you're presented with a pay package with a recruiter, sometimes they might just tell you this job is going to pay this amount per week. You definitely want to ask them, are you quoting it to me before tax or after tax? So if they say this job is paying $2,000 a week gross, then you're like, great, that sounds like a lot of money. Can you tell me an estimate of what that would be after tax? And then they might ask you something like, well, how do you file your taxes? And if you're newer to your career and you're not really familiar with how your pay is taxed, a lot of you guys, if you're single and don't have any dependents, they call that filing single and zero. And so most travel recruiters will just quote the pay based on filing taxes single and zero. And that'll give you a rough estimate of how much the IRS is going to take out in taxes for your situation. But if you're a little more experienced clinician, you have more experience with understanding the way your pay gets taxed, the way your tax filing status is, maybe you're married, maybe you have children, you do have dependents, then you might tell them, no, I filed my taxes this way, can you run the pay package this way? And they'll be able to tell you that after tax rough estimate of your weekly take-home pay.
Yeah, and if you are quoted a gross pay number, which is not as common, but some recruiters do give a gross number because they don't feel comfortable like taking into account your tax situation, things like that, you need to understand how much of your pay is taxable. So usually as a traveler, the taxable portion of your pay will probably be somewhere between $20 and $30 an hour. That's pretty average. And then you have the tax-free stipends added onto that. So you need to understand that, because if you want to break it down yourself, a good rule of thumb is that in general, your tax rate is probably going to be somewhere between 75 and 80% of the gross pay is going to be, the gross taxable pay is going to be your take-home pay from that portion. So if you take, like, say you're making $25 an hour, working 40 hours a week, that's $1,000 a week taxable, then probably your take-home pay is going to be somewhere in the $750 to $800 range, and then you add stipends onto that amount.
So when you're looking at your pay package that's presented to you, again, they might just initially, when they're telling you about the job, they might just tell you a rough estimate of the weekly take-home pay. And then once you get more into like deciding whether you're going to accept the job, they'll show you an actual breakdown. And it might say something like $20 an hour taxable plus this amount for stipends each week. So if you see something that says $20 an hour taxable plus $1,000 stipend, the way you would run that is you just multiply $20 an hour by the number of hours you expect to work, usually hopefully 40, so it'd be 20 times 40. Get that number, or the example Jared used was $25 an hour times 40. It's an easier calculation. Gives you 1,000, right? And then you subtract out the taxes from that 1,000, and that would give you about $750 or $800. And then you add in the other 1,000 that's not going to be taxed, and now you've got a pay package of about $1,750 or $1,800 a week. That's the very basics of travel therapy pay before we get into all the other things like reimbursements and stuff like that.
Yeah. One thing to cover here too is that the stipend amount, we get this question a lot, like what is the stipend amount based on? Well, there's two things that it's really based on. There is a maximum that you're able to receive depending on the area that you're working in. So the government, the GSA, sets a standard rate for each area of the country, and it's based on cost of living for that area. So you can go to the GSA website and type in like the zip code or the city that you're working in, and it'll tell you what the maximum is. Well, some people will look at that and they're like, oh wait, I'm not getting the maximum amount. Well, you're not always going to get the maximum amount, because the other factor is how much the facility is paying the travel company. If they're not paying the travel company enough for them to take a portion of the pay and then pay you the rest and max out those stipends, then you're not going to get the maximum. So remember, that's not how much you're going to get paid in stipends. That's just the maximum you can. Often, if you're working in somewhere that's like rural, low cost of living, you can max that out. But there are some places like San Francisco where the cost of living is huge and those GSA maximums are really high where you might not max it out. So you're not always going to get the maximum, but that's kind of how stipends are determined, based on the GSA max and the pay rate, the bill rate of the facility.
Yeah, and we'll get into talking more about what a bill rate is here in a little while, and talking about like where the money comes from, where it goes. That way, because a lot of you guys might be wondering, well, how do I negotiate these numbers? You know, they might tell me this is what it is, but what if I want more? But let's get into that in a little bit. So understanding the absolute basics of a travel therapy pay package, it looks like an hourly tax number plus a stipend number. Now again, sometimes the recruiters will present the stipend number as a weekly amount, like they might just say $1,000 a week, or they might say $300 a week for meals and incidentals and $700 a week for housing. Add those two things together, $1,000 a week. Sometimes they actually present it as an hourly number also, and then that just might involve you doing another calculation to get that hourly number times 40 hours. Other times they present it as a daily number. That's where it gets a little more confusing, because you have to decide, is it a daily number times 5 work days, or is it a daily number times 7 days in a week? So this is where you'd want to ask the recruiter, well, okay, that's great. Can you tell me roughly what it would be per week, just so you can compare offers side by side and make sure you're talking about the same thing, because it really stinks if you're talking to one recruiter and they're like, oh, it's a $2,000 a week gross pay package, and then the other one says it's $1,500 a week net, and you're like, oh, this one sounds so much better, it's $2,000. Well, not so fast. That one was gross and this one was net. So make sure you're trying to get the pay packages presented to you in a similar manner so you can really compare side by side.
Yeah, and even if they aren't able to present it in the same manner, recruiters do things differently. At least have the knowledge to be able to compare apples to apples yourself. So like Whitney said, if one presents a weekly stipend number and another one presents an hourly, you have to understand that you can just multiply those and then compare it apples to apples instead of this, kind of weird comparison.
There's also a website you guys can use that's called paycheckcity.com, where you can actually run the hourly portion, the taxable portion, through there based on your actual state, I think your zip code, or I don't know if it's just your state, as well as your tax filing status, and that'll show you exactly what you would make after taxes, and then add that to your stipend. That would give you a good estimate as well. But it's important, check out that article I'll link to here in just a little bit, to look at exactly how this is broken down and be able to better run those calculations yourself.
Yeah, so hopefully all that makes sense. If that didn't make sense or you have any questions about this, feel free to ask those below. We'll go through all the questions at the end, but that's the basics of how like the actual take-home amount works. And now we're going to talk about what extra things you might find in a pay package in terms of reimbursements and things like that.
So in addition to your just general weekly take-home, which is your hourly plus your stipends, often they'll offer reimbursements for things. Like maybe they'll reimburse you for the cost of getting your license in that state, or they might reimburse you for what they call beginning or ending travel, and that's like a mileage. So if you're moving from Virginia to California, they might pay you whatever the federal mileage rate is, which I think is like 55 cents per mile to travel out there. Or sometimes if you choose to fly to your assignment, they might reimburse you for your airline ticket. There are certain situations where they might reimburse you for continuing education or scrubs or uniforms, or if you had to pay for your own like drug screen or things like that. There could be certain reimbursements in your pay package. So what's important here is these are usually one-time payments. They're going to be paid either on like your first, they'll specify in your contract. Is it going to be paid one time on your first paycheck, your second paycheck, your last paycheck? And what I like to do sometimes is I look at these as like bonuses. You know, it's like you get that amount one time. So if you kind of want to compare a pay package where, say, this recruiter isn't giving you any reimbursements, but they're like, you're going to make $1,900 a week take home, right? Well, this other recruiter, you're going to make $1,700 a week take home, but they have all these extra reimbursements. Sounds so great. What you can do is just divide them out by 13 weeks. So if I'm getting $500 in reimbursements, that's like, sweet, I get that $500 up front. We'll divide that by 13, and that might be, you know, a handful of dollars each week in addition to that pay package. So then you can kind of see and compare with the other pay packages that didn't have reimbursements.
Yeah, and this is where some people get confused because if you're comparing pay packages and one recruiter has a ton of reimbursements and the other one doesn't, a lot of people just look at the take-home pay number. And some companies and recruiters will optimize for that because they know that's what people usually compare. So they will try to maximize that number and then neglect reimbursements, which it's not necessarily a bad thing. It just really depends on your situation, what you want, how much you need up front, those kind of things. But it's important to be aware of that. You need to take the reimbursements into account. So let's say you're at an assignment and you're comparing with another traveler there, and you and the other traveler made $100 a week more than you. A lot of people feel really bad about that, but sometimes they don't realize that that traveler got no reimbursements and they're taking the bare minimum health insurance, whereas you got a bunch of reimbursements up front and you have a more expensive health insurance plan, things like that. So always take all the factors into account when you're comparing pay packages.
Absolutely, and we're going to get more into that, just understanding why different companies pay differently, but it helps you guys to be informed travelers, to understand where all the money comes from, how the multiple ways that you could run a pay package, because there's so many travelers that just feel as though when they look at things on the surface level, they're like, this recruiter's taking advantage of me. And it's not always the case. I would say majority of recruiters are pretty good. They're doing the best they can. Now, there are shady ones out there. You know, we have done our best to vet recruiters through our years of traveling and try to recommend to you guys recruiters that we trust. And we know if it's a recruiter that we trust, that we've worked with, that's been in the industry for many years, they're not out to get the travelers. You know, it might just be a limitation on the bill rate from the facility or the overhead of the company. Again, we'll get into all this, but we're trying to help you guys understand how to calculate these things yourself, where to know, okay, can I ask for more money here, or can they explain this to me better so that I can get the most out of this and know whether or not they're taking advantage of me.
Yeah, and being taken advantage of by a recruiter is a common concern for a lot of new travelers and experienced travelers alike. We were in that same position when we started, and we get those kind of questions all the time. How do you know if a recruiter's taking advantage of you? It's hard to know because you will almost never know what the bill rate of a contract is as a traveler. So you don't really know how much they're getting, you don't know how much they're keeping, those kind of things. But what you have to realize is that the majority of travelers we've talked to, or recruiters we've talked to, probably 100 or more at this point, they understand that the travel therapy world is all about relationships and word of mouth. So the majority of them are not out to make a buck in the short term because they want to have a good reputation for the long term. They want to keep travelers for years. It makes their job much easier. So most recruiters are not trying to take advantage of you. There are some that are. So you just want to make sure that you get some that are recommended to you, vetted by someone, and you have a much better chance that way. But realize that most recruiters have at least mostly your best interest in mind, and they want to keep you around.
Absolutely. So now that we understand kind of the basics of a pay package, we know that we want to look at our hourly taxed amount. We want to look at our stipends, which are usually going to be untaxed. We want to look and see if there's any reimbursements. There's some special considerations when you start to to compare pay packages. We already sort of touched on comparing gross versus net pay, super important. That's the number one thing you want to look at. The next thing, you want to see whether or not the stipends are quoted as the weekly, the daily, or the hourly amount. That way you can make sure you're comparing apples to apples. The next thing that's really interesting that a lot of companies have started doing is whether or not they're guaranteeing stipends. So we want to explain to you what that means.
Yeah, so some companies, if you work, let's say, 33 hours a week, or 33 hours in 1 week, say you have 32 hours guaranteed and you work 33 hours in a week, the pay is always going to be based on 40 hours, even if you have a 32-hour guarantee in your contract. So if you work 33 hours, there are some companies that will prorate the stipends based on the number of hours worked. So they would basically take your weekly stipends, usually it's going to be a weekly amount, they will divide that by 40, and then so you miss 7 hours that week, they'll take 7 hours worth of stipend off of the paycheck.
In addition to 7 hours off your hourly.
Yeah, in addition to that. But the weird part about that is just because you worked 7 hours less does not mean that you had 7 hours less of expenses at your contract, right? So the stipend is supposed to be a reimbursement for your expenses. That's why it's tax-free. So it's kind of a gray area when companies do that. So some companies will pay you the full amount no matter what. Some prorate those stipends. And there's definitely a gray area in terms of legality and in terms of how that works.
So it's really important to ask the company that you're working with if you think there's any reason why you might not get a full 40 hours. Find out whether the stipends are guaranteed or not guaranteed. Typically in the past, they were never guaranteed, but it's a newer thing where some companies that are caught up in some, worrying about the legality of it, they're like, we're just going to guarantee the stipends across the board, which means they're just going to pay you the same housing and meals and incidental stipends no matter if you only work 15 hours that week. They're just going to pay you the same, which is pretty sweet for you because then you still get that $1,000 untaxed even if your hourly number of hours goes down. So find that information out so that way when you're running your potential pay packages you can understand, if I don't have a 40-hour guarantee, what might my pay package look like? And this leads right into the next part of understanding what is your weekly take-home going to be in one example if you work a full 40 hours, in the second example if you don't get your full 40 hours.
Yeah, and something to add there is you might think after hearing that, well, I'll just only work with companies that guarantee stipends, right? And a lot of travelers choose to do that. There is a downside, I would say, of that, though, for those companies that a lot of people don't realize. And the thing about a company guaranteeing stipends is, let's say you only work 33 hours, they still pay you the stipend amount for 40. They only get paid for 33, right? So they're losing money on those hours, and they're taking that hit in order to be able to guarantee your stipends. That sounds wonderful. But the issue is they have to have a separate budget to account for when that happens, which means that they're usually going to take a larger percentage of all the pay packages across the board to have that separate budget. So a lot of times the companies that guarantee stipends might end up paying a little bit less as your normal weekly take home in order to account for when that happens. So you just have to weigh the pros and cons there. Like, you're usually going to get paid a little bit less, but then you have less uncertainty on your contract because you always know you're going to get the stipends. So, it's an individual decision, but realize that guaranteed stipends are not just a godsend that is great for everyone. There is a downside there as well.
As you guys can see, the more we talk about this stuff, it's complicated, right? Like, there's a lot that goes into pay and understanding pay, which is why, it's a little frustrating when we see new travelers. They just feel like they're being taken advantage of. They feel like, oh, well, how come this, traveler said this and this recruiter said this? There's a lot that goes into it. So we really just want you guys to be well educated, understand all the behind the scenes stuff so you can really make good decisions about your career, about your pay, about which company to work with. But there's a little bit more than meets the eye.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. People saying only do this and only do this, and they just have a very limited perspective. They don't understand all the behind the scenes things and things like companies keeping extra overhead in order to account for those kinds of unexpected expenses. So think about those things. Realize that there's a lot of nuance with travel therapy.
Absolutely. So these are some things to consider when you are looking at what your weekly take home might be. Now, if you have a 40-hour guarantee, which we always recommend trying to ask if that's a possibility. If they guarantee 40 hours, then your pay is just always going to be the same, right? A lot of our contracts in the past, we had guaranteed 40 hours. So Our hourly, if it was $20 an hour, it was always going to be times 40. Our stipend was always going to be exactly the same, the weekly amount. There was not going to be any prorating of those numbers. However, there are some facilities out there that will not guarantee 40 hours. So if you have a recruiter that says, this contract guarantees 32 hours, they do expect that you're going to work 40. So what is really good, if the recruiter, some good recruiters will do it like this for you. They'll quote you, this is what your pay would be if you work 40 hours. This is what your pay would be if you only work the guarantee, which is 32. However, if the recruiter does not present it that way to you, you can run those calculations yourself just so you can curb your expectations for budgeting.
Yeah.
Because we get a lot of people that become disappointed because the recruiter presents it almost 9 times out of 10, they're all going to present it to you as 40 hours. But then you get your first paycheck and you only worked 32 that week and you're like, I didn't make as much as I said I was going to make. But yeah, because you only worked 32 hours.
Yeah, and that's where it's vital to know whether the stipends are guaranteed when you do these calculations, because if the recruiter doesn't present it, they present it as 40, you only have a 32-hour guarantee. You need to make sure you can pay all your bills with 32, and you need to know exactly what that amount will be to know if you can pay everything, and that's something that you're willing to take.
And for some people, this might mean the difference between, say, this one job is presented to you, and it's a super high pay package based on 40 hours, but it's only a 32-hour guarantee, and maybe say that company doesn't guarantee stipends. So okay, wow, it's $2,000 a week for 40 hours, but if it's going to be only 32, maybe I'm only going to make $1,500 or whatever. Whereas this other contract is paying $1,800 a week, but they are guaranteeing stipends and they're guaranteeing 40 hours. So I'm no matter what always going to make 18. That could make a difference for you in comparing two pay packages as whether there's a guarantee or not.
Yeah, and that you wouldn't actually make 18 though. You would still miss the taxable portion of your pay if you only work 32. You're not going to get, if it's a guaranteed 32 and you only work 30 hours, you get paid for 32, not for 40. So you'd still miss the taxable portion of your pay, but you would still get the stipends.
Oh, sorry. I was saying both. If you got both the guaranteed hours and the guaranteed stipends.
Yeah, okay.
So if this contract over here has 40 hours guaranteed, you're always going to get paid the max.
I gotcha.
Versus a contract that only had 32 hours guaranteed. Yeah, so there's two different types of guarantees to look at there. Super important when you're comparing your pay packages. Look at whether or not you have a 40-hour guarantee and look at whether or not you have a stipend guarantee.
Yep. Nick says, sounds as complicated as past relationships. Yes. Yeah,
yes,
it's
Nick.
complicated.
Complicated. So I hope that makes sense to you guys. Again, I am going to link to some articles after we finish the video. I think for some people, it's helpful to read all this stuff written out, see the numbers in front of you, run some example pay packages so you can better understand this. It'll also start to make more sense when you guys start getting offers. Like if you're new to travel therapy and you're going through the process of working with recruiters for the first time and you start comparing offers, it's going to make more sense. You're going to be like, oh, I see, this recruiter is presenting it like this, but this recruiter is presenting it like this. And now you're going to understand, now that's what Whitney and Jared were talking about, So this will all start to fall into place once you get into the weeds of this.
Yeah, it's really important to understand this because so many times we see a traveler gets 2 offers from 2 different companies and they're not taking into account all these things, reimbursements, hourly guarantees. They're not taking into account whether stipends are guaranteed, and they just see a difference of like $200 a week and they think, oh, that company's really taking advantage of me, I'm just never going to work with that recruiter. And they just don't understand all the other things that go into getting that number, and sometimes the take-home pay is not all that matters. There's other things to consider when accepting a contract.
For sure. One other note I want to say about looking at pay packages. This seemed glaringly obvious to us before, but we have received a number of questions about it, so apparently it's not so obvious when you're new to this. When they present pay packages to you, it's almost always going to be before insurance deductions. Because a lot of travelers will be like, well, they said I was going to make, $1,800 a week, but after my first paycheck, I only made $1,725. Well, that's because if you choose to elect insurance, they're going to take your insurance out each week.
Yeah.
Whereas when you first sign the contract, they don't know what insurance you're going to elect to choose or if you're going to accept their insurance or not. So they can't quote you the pay based on insurance. That they could give you a rough estimate if you happen to ask. I have seen some recruiters that will say, hey, are you going to take the insurance? That way they can curb your expectations. But just know that they quote it before insurance deductions.
Yeah, and I mean, that makes a lot of sense because the recruiter can't know. A lot of times the companies have like 3 insurance options. And once you accept a contract, then you need to choose which one. So they can't know if you're going to take insurance or which insurance plan you're going to choose. So yeah, always know. And that's pretty consistent with permanent jobs as well. The pay you're quoted is going to be before insurance and also before like 401k contributions and things like that. So always keep that in mind.
Yeah, of course, because they have no idea how much you're going to choose to put in your 401k or if you're going to choose to use it or not. But just keep that in mind. Like, back when we were maxing out our 401k, my actual weekly take-home pay was like $900 a week because I was shoveling money into my 401k, which is paying myself for later, which is awesome. So just keep those things in mind, especially for newer graduates who this is going to be your first career move. It can be a little confusing when you look at your very first, big boy, big girl job paycheck. You're like, wait, but they took out taxes and they took out insurance and where'd my 401k money go? It looks like I'm not making any money, but you still are. It's just keep those things in mind.
All right, so bill rates?
Yeah, so the last thing we want to just tie this all together is where does the money come from and where does the money have to go? Because this is like really the underlying thing to all this is a lot of you guys are like, that's great, Whitney and Jared, you've explained to us like what it might look like, but what if we want more money? Can we just ask for more and they'll just magically give us more? Not necessarily.
Yeah, so remember that as a traveler, there are 2 contracts to any assignment that you accept. There's your contract with the travel company, and then there's a contract between the travel company and the facility. And we don't see that contract between the travel company and the facility. And what that, there's a variety of things in there, obviously a lot of legal terminology and everything in that contract, but the big thing in that is the bill rate. And the bill rate is an hourly amount that the facility is agreeing to pay the travel company based on how many hours you work, right? So that is what they use as the basis to determine how much they can pay you. So the travel company has the facility they sign this contract with the facility with a bill rate, and usually that's somewhere between $55 an hour and maybe really high paying contracts we've seen all the way up to like $80 or $85 an hour. But in most cases, it's probably going to be like in the $60 to $65 to $70 an hour range. So they use that number, they subtract out whatever overhead percentage they need to keep, and then the rest they break down into your taxable, your stipends, and your reimbursements, and then they present that to you as the pay package. So that's where all the money comes from that hourly rate from the facility.
Yeah. We want to dig more into understanding bill rates, understanding where the money has to go and all that. But before we finish talking about this, if you guys are enjoying this video, if you're learning anything, if it's been valuable to you, please hit the thumbs up button. We'd love if you like or heart this video. If you have a friend that needs to know this information too, tag them in this video, share it with them, let them know so they can learn too. Again, I am going to go back at the end of the video, link to some articles that explain this stuff in further detail. This is absolutely essential if you're considering travel therapy to understand how pay works and understand all this behind the scenes stuff so you can take advantage of this career and be well informed.
Yeah, and again, if you guys have any questions or comments, leave those below. We saw a bunch of questions already. We're going to go back through those at the end. So don't get discouraged. We haven't gone over those yet.
Happy to answer any questions you guys have. Just leave them in the comments. All right, so as we've kind of said here, the bill rate is how much the facility pays the travel company. Now, out of that bill rate, they've got to do a lot, right? So what we lump together and we call it their overhead. Different companies have different amounts of overhead, and this is a big reason why some companies will pay differently for the exact same job. Typically, as a rule of thumb, you can think of a bigger company as having more overhead because they have more employees to pay, they have bigger budgets for certain departments and all this, whereas smaller companies tend to have less overhead. However, that's only one piece of the picture.
Yeah, and a way that you can kind of think about this too is I like to use the analogy of like a house. So if you have a small house, your utilities are going to be a lot lower on average. Electricity, to heat it, to cool it, it's going to be lower. Versus if you have a huge house, your utilities are going to be a little higher. So that's kind of how it is with companies. The smaller companies are usually going to have lower overhead costs. The bigger companies are usually going to have bigger overhead costs. If they have bigger overhead costs, they usually have to keep a higher percentage of the bill rate. So that is a very important thing to realize.
Yeah. So you might look at that and say, great, that means big companies keep more money, I'm going to make less money. Small companies keep less money, I'm going to make more money. Easy peasy, right? Well, not so fast because there are other factors that affect how these companies can pay us. Sometimes companies will have what are called direct clients or direct relationships with a facility. And what that usually means is, they have a direct connection with the manager and the facility, and they're like, hey, here's this job, advertise it for us, send us a candidate, great. Sometimes they have to go through what are called vendor management systems. So instead of there being a direct connection, they have to pay fees to get access to that job. So that'd be something like, say they have to pay a fee to use Indeed.com to access the database and get the job. So if they want to go and get that job and present it to their candidates, they've got to pay fees, vendor management fees. So sometimes the big companies, even though they have bigger overhead, have more direct relationships and don't have to pay fees. Whereas the small companies, in order to access the database, have to pay fees.
Yeah, so what that looks like in reality is that the big company is still keeping a larger percentage of the total pay package than the small company, but the small company has to pay fees that a lot of times will offset or sometimes be even higher if it's a direct client of the big company and not the small company. Mm-hmm. And the big companies have more of these relationships. So it depends on the job, whether or not that impacts you. It could be a small company has a direct relationship and then you get paid really well because there's no fees to take out in addition to what they're paying you. But it just depends on the job.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's no hard and fast rule, and this is why we recommend working with more than one company. We always work with at least 3 different recruiters at 3 different companies, usually 1 or 2 big ones, 1 or 2 small ones, and then you have a variety of options being presented to you. But the reason we like to explain this is if you understand things like this, sometimes your recruiters, when you build better relationships with you, they'll explain the situation. They'll present something to you and be like, hey, we have this job you really want in San Diego. It's the setting you want, and it's the location that you want. But I just want to let you know the bill rate is a little bit lower on this job. It's a vendor job. We have a fee on it. We can only pay so much. It's only $1,700 a week, not $2,000 a week. But it's exactly what you want. So if you have a good relationship with your recruiter, sometimes they'll explain to you some of the behind the scene things and they'll be transparent with you. But if you don't know what any of that stuff means, if you don't understand direct clients and vendors and fees and all these things, then you might just think, whatever, you're lying to me because you should be paying way more than $1,700 for that job in San Diego. Whereas this other recruiter might be like, I'm paying $1,900 for that job in San Diego. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that affects how much they have the ability to pay you.
Yeah, one other thing to talking about San Diego, because that's a very popular destination that travelers want to go to. It's expensive to live in San Diego, as everyone knows. So people expect to be paid really well for jobs like that. But also what you have to realize in terms of the stipends and things like that is more so than the cost of living in the area, supply and demand are what determine pay packages. So San Diego is a very desirable location. So if a job opens, they might get 20 applicants. So they don't need to pay as much as, say, a rural area in North Dakota where they don't get as many applicants. So a lot of times it's not really the cost of living in the area that determines pay. It's more the supply and demand of that area, how many potential travelers they get for an open position.
Yep, supply and demand as well as reimbursement for the state. We just got a question today from a CODA, an occupational therapist assistant who was looking at a job in Hawaii, and they said, the pay for this one, the pay package is really super low for what the cost of living is going to be in Hawaii. Unfortunately, that's the case. We're in Hawaii right now. I'm on a travel contract, and it's one of my lower paying travel contracts I've ever taken.
I think it's the lowest you've ever taken.
I've made more in rural Virginia, rural North Carolina, where my expenses were, pennies on the dollar compared to here. My expenses are super high here. Unfortunately, the reimbursement for the state of Hawaii is less for therapy services. So you get reimbursed, the facility gets reimbursed lower when I bill an evaluation or a therapeutic activity or a therapeutic exercise than if I was sitting in a building and billing the same codes and the same diagnoses in California. So things like this affect the amount that the facility pays, which then affects the bill rate, which then affects the amount the recruiter can pay you.
Yep.
So you guys have to know where the money comes from and where it goes to better understand why pay is the way it is. And it's not always just the easy answer of the recruiter's lying to me and the recruiter's taking advantage of me. There's a lot more that goes into it than that.
Yeah, one other thing I think is very important to cover here too is in terms of bill rates and overhead costs and those kind of things. The way it usually works, we found this out over years, talking to a bunch of different recruiters and things. Usually most companies that we've talked to, the way they have their recruiters try to present pay, they'll have a range of overhead that they are allowed to keep. So they'll have a low end and a high end, and say that's somewhere between, they need to keep somewhere between 18 and 25% of the bill rate on average for them to cover all of their expenses, pay their employees, pay for the buildings, pay the vendor fees if there are, those kind of things. So they need to keep somewhere in that range. A lot of times there's some flexibility there. It might be a tighter range than that, but there's often flexibility, and it depends on the job, how competitive you are as a candidate. It depends on how competitive the job is. Sometimes the company will take more or less of that percentage, and that's really the wiggle room that they have to negotiate. So some recruiters will present you with a lower pay up front, maybe on the higher end they're trying to keep more of that percentage, and some will present you with the bare minimum that they're allowed to keep to try to get you to take the job. And there's a lot of factors that play in there, but realize that a lot of time there's wiggle room, but it really depends on the specific recruiter and how they're approaching the initial offer that they give you. Sometimes that is really all that they can offer, and sometimes there's a little wiggle room if you have another job that you might take, or if you're the only candidate at that job, they really want you to take it. Sometimes they can wiggle there.
Yeah. So when it comes to, we get a lot of questions about how do I negotiate higher pay? There's only ever two ways that you can get higher pay than the initial offer. The first way is if the recruiter has any wiggle room, like Jared was saying, in their margins. Their boss is breathing down their neck to try to keep, this standard amount, but if they really, want to try to get you into this job, they might have a little bit of wiggle room. It shouldn't be a huge jump. If you're working with an honest recruiter, they shouldn't just suddenly come up with hundreds of dollars extra per week.
Yeah, that's a red flag for sure.
So it's usually just going to be a small amount of wiggle room. If you're working with an honest recruiter, hopefully they gave you close to their absolute best offer up front. So that's one way if there was a little wiggle room on what the recruiter can control. The second way would be is if they actually go back to the facility and ask for a higher bill rate for you, or present you when they present your application, they can put in for a higher bill rate, but they usually will only do this if you're one of the only candidates or they know you're one of the absolute best candidates. Like say that you worked at the facility before, or you worked for that same organization in a different location before, and they already know that you're gonna just be killer for that interview. Like say it's like Kaiser, like a really common West Coast company, Kaiser, and they know you've done a Kaiser home health contract in a different state, and you're one of the only applicants, and you've got a great resume, you've got 6 years of experience in home health, and you're going to hit the ground running. Well, say the bill rate is presented at $60 an hour, but your recruiter knows you're a shoo-in for this job. They might, off the bat, submit your application for $70 an hour because they're like, you're going to get this job. But if you're a new grad and you don't have experience and there's 20 other candidates, they might actually do the opposite. They might try to submit you at a lower bill rate to make you more competitive, because the facility might look at it like, well, we've got 20 candidates and they're all like, roughly the same, but this one is willing to take the job for less money, so we're going to give it to that one.
Yeah.
And that happens. And as a new grad, I know we all want to make the most money, but sometimes it's actually a good strategy. If you have a good recruiter who's willing to do that for you, it's sometimes important to get your foot in the door and get that first job on your resume at, a cost, at a little bit lower of a pay rate. So there is a lot that goes into it. But again, if you're asking the question, how can I negotiate more money? There's only two places. Either the recruiter has a little bit of wiggle room, or they actually go back and ask the facility for more money, which is rare.
Yeah, changing the bill rate is always going to be very dependent on how competitive the market is, how competitive that job is. If it's a job that's been sitting open 3 weeks and you're the only candidate, then yeah, maybe you can ask for more money. But if they already have other applicants, chances are they're going to take one of the other applicants for a lower amount. And if you try to increase the pay significantly, you're just not going to get the job. So we run into that a lot with travelers. They want to really increase the pay to take it. Well, you can try. You can tell your recruiter, submit me at a higher rate, but they're probably just not going to take you. Yep. So it's a balancing act.
Absolutely. So we want to kind of go back and just give a brief summary of everything we've talked about, just to give you guys, a bird's eye view of how pay works. Again, I am going to link to some additional articles. I think sometimes it's a lot easier to look at this in written format. It's important for you guys to get out a calculator, run a few calculations so you can better understand pay. Before we get into our summary, if you have any lingering questions, please ask them in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button. If you enjoyed it, you can leave us a comment and say thank you. We do appreciate it. We like to get the feedback from you guys if this was educational, if it was valuable, if you learned something. I know some of you guys will go back and listen to this on the replay. Thank you. Some of you guys will go back and listen on our podcast. If you're not familiar, we do upload all of our Facebook Live videos to our podcast, so you can listen on any podcast platform. It's called Travel Therapy Mentor Podcast, if you prefer that versus the Facebook videos. We also have a YouTube channel, which I sometimes upload videos to. It's been a couple months. A while. So eventually these will get uploaded to YouTube, but not that often. So yeah, let us know if you have any questions, any feedback. We will answer all of your questions. But just to give you guys a brief overview of everything we talked about, we'll go into a summary here.
All right, so pay is broken down into taxable pay that you have to subtract out taxes for, and then stipends, which are not taxed. And you add those two together to get your weekly take-home number. And that's what most recruiters and travelers are going to talk about in terms of pay. It's not as simple as a salary number or a simple hourly number like you would have at a permanent job. It makes it a little more complicated, and that confuses some new travelers.
Yep, so it's hourly times the number of hours you work. So if the hourly number is $20 an hour times, hopefully you work 40 hours, multiply that out, subtract taxes from there. A rough estimate for your taxes might be 25%, but again, depending on how you file your taxes, that number will be different. Add that number to the weekly stipend number, you'll get a weekly take-home amount. Helps you to compare side by side with different recruiters, different companies, understanding that weekly take-home after-tax amount. Make sure if a recruiter presents it to you as gross pay, ask them if they can please present it to you as net pay or after-tax pay.
And if not, do that yourself. In addition to that, you'll have reimbursements. Usually on most contracts, some companies don't really do reimbursements. They just pay it all as a weekly take-home amount. Others will pay a lower weekly take-home amount and reimburse you. Just realize that that is a balancing thing. So if you're going to get reimbursements, your weekly take-home pay is going to be a little lower. If you don't take reimbursements, it's going to be a little higher. And not necessarily a good or bad thing, it's just something to realize.
Yep, something important to point out there, I don't think we mentioned this earlier. Different companies also do different reimbursements differently. I said different way too many times. They do reimbursements differently. There are certain companies that keep a separate budget for certain reimbursements like licensure. There are companies that have a licensure department that has its own budget, just the way like their marketing department would have a budget and blah, blah, blah. So occasionally you will have a company that will pay you a license reimbursement on top of your pay package without subtracting any money out of your pay package. However, I think that's more rare. Most companies, any reimbursement that you're going to get is just going to come from that same pie, that same bill rate. So whether or not you take a reimbursement or don't take a reimbursement, your pay is essentially going to be the same. It's just a matter of whether you want that reimbursement up front or you want it trickled out throughout the contract. Some people like to get it up front because say your contract gets canceled, well, at least you got $500 up front for your license. Whereas if they had divided $500 out across 13 weeks in your weekly pay, you might never see all of that money if you got your contract canceled. So keep that in mind with reimbursements. Most of the time they're coming out of the same pie of money.
The next thing is make sure that you know whether you have guaranteed stipends or if they're going to be prorated if you don't work 40 hours. And to calculate the pay based on the minimum that you'll make if you don't work the full number of hours and 40 hours, and compare those and make sure that the minimum that you're going to make is enough to cover all of your expenses and that the travel contract is still worth it to you. Otherwise, you might want to pass on that, either find one that pays more or find one that guarantees 40 hours so you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, it's super important to curb your expectations and help with your budgeting so you can understand how much am I definitely going to make at minimum each week versus what like I hope to make if I get my full 40 hours. And then in addition to that, definitely keep in mind that when recruiters quote pay, it's typically before any insurance deductions and it's definitely before any 401k deductions.
Yep, and remember that just because a company doesn't guarantee stipends, that's not necessarily a bad thing because probably the companies that do guaranteed stipends are keeping a little bit more of the bill rate, so you're probably making a little bit less with those companies on contracts. So just depends on what you want.
And the last thing to understand is where does the money come from and where does that money have to go? The money comes from the facility that pays the travel company that pays you. That's called the bill rate. The bill rate is what the facility pays the company, and then the company takes the bill rate, pays all of their overhead and expenses, and then divides up and makes you a pay package of what they're going to pay you each week, what reimbursements they're going to pay you. All the money has to come from somewhere, and it's important to realize what that money has to cover. It has to cover, the company's part of paying your insurance, the company's part of paying your credentialing costs and things like that, keeping their lights on, paying their recruiters, having their building rent.
Also, your half of employment taxes. A lot of people don't realize that your employer pays 7.65% of your taxable pay on your behalf to for things like Social Security and Medicare later in life.
So it's important to know when you're talking about wanting to negotiate pay, understanding where that money comes from, how much the recruiter really has control over it versus what they don't have control over. Know about understand the concept of a bill rate and what that has to cover. It's also really important to, understand why different companies might pay different for different jobs. So that way, when you're comparing side by side, it really can be the case that a very honest recruiter at company A pays differently than a very honest recruiter at company B. There's only so much that's in their control, and sometimes it's hard to compare between companies.
Very true. I think that's it.
Yeah.
All right, let's go through some questions and comments.
All right, guys, I hope that was a good summary. We'll answer any questions you have. Again, if you have any additional questions, feel free to leave them in the comments.
Tyler says, for your Hawaii contract, did they help you help reimburse you to get your car down there?
Oh, we did not bring a car, so we just rented a car while we're here because we're from the East Coast. I know there are certain people that would choose to ship their car.
It would be very expensive from the East Coast.
Very
it would probably
expensive.
I would bet it's like $4,000.
Yeah, I guess you could probably, if you lived on the West Coast, maybe ship it over in a, on a boat for a couple $1,000s. So we didn't do that. Now, in terms of other reimbursements for my contract, I did get a reimbursement of like $250 for my license, and another reimbursement of $250 for my travel expenses to get over here, like my plane ticket. However, again, I took into account that that's all part of the pay package. If I hadn't gotten those reimbursements, my weekly take home might have been a little higher.
Yeah, it would be really hard unless you're going to be here for a long time. It probably doesn't make sense to ship your car because we're renting a car for $600 a month, so it's going to cost, we're here 2 months, $1,200, whereas shipping the car would probably be that much or more each way. So
yeah.
Probably doesn't make sense to ship
and
cars.
Some people choose to buy a car when they're in Hawaii, especially if they're going to be here 6 months or more. Just buy a used car for $5,000 or $6,000 and then hopefully sell it again when you leave. I know right now the used car market is super competitive, so it's a little harder to do right now. We chose not to do that. Aja says this was so helpful. Thank you. We appreciate that feedback. Nick giving us more jokes. Thank you for always being there for entertainment, Nick. We appreciate you. Levi says, I just took my first travel contract as a PT, and so far you are spot on with how the contracts go.
Yeah, thanks. It's one of those things that it takes a long time to learn all this stuff. We had no idea about most of this stuff for even our first 2 or 3 years as travelers, how things worked. It really took us interviewing a bunch of recruiters, asking them a bunch of questions to try to find ones that we liked and ones that we could recommend to other people for us to really realize how everything works and how much nuance there really is. It's not a simple thing.
And it took us seeing different pay packages from different companies to be like, oh, we took for granted that not all recruiters and companies present these things the same. So we're able to better understand and teach you guys. If you're working with company A, B, C, and D, they might not present pay all the same. So we want you guys to be well educated and informed. Darian says, I'm a third-year student. When should I be looking and talking with recruiters?
Really depends on when you're taking the board exam. I would say probably 2 to 3 months before you plan to start traveling, like your actual start date, is a good time to start reaching out because you want to form relationships with a few recruiters, find who you like. You want to make sure you have all of your upfront paperwork done so that when it's time to be submitted for jobs, you're ready to go because a lot of people plan to travel, say June 1st, and they start contacting recruiters like a week before, and it takes a couple weeks to even get your paperwork filled out and then start getting submitted for jobs. So give yourself at least 2 or 3 months would be good.
Absolutely. If you guys are interested, you can fill out our recruiter recommendation form on our website. I have written on there that we recommend waiting until at least 3 months of graduation, but ideally 3 months of your board exam because a lot of people, like I know for PTs, a lot of them take boards in July after a May graduation, so realistically you shouldn't do it until 3 months before July.
Lauren says, any specific travel companies you guys would recommend for new grads? I've been looking into Med Travelers. It really depends. It depends on the setting you're looking for. It depends on the location you're looking at. It depends on the benefits you need. So like, is health insurance something you need, or are you on your parents' plan? Those kind of things. It depends on like if you want the highest pay possible, depending on, like we talked about, the size of the company. So there's a lot of variables to think about. So it really, if you fill out the recruiter recommendation form on our website, we ask all those questions so that we can match you with recruiters and companies that should work well for you, because there's not one blanket answer.
And that's what we've done over the last several years. Like we mentioned, we've taken the time to interview and vet all these different companies. When you guys contact us, if Lauren contacts us and somebody else contacts us, we don't send you the same three. We read everything that you fill out on that form, and we give you recommendations based on your preferences, based on what you tell us, because it's not going to be the same answer for everybody.
Yep.
So reach out to us if you want those recommendations specific to you. All right, let's see what other questions we have here, guys. Andy says, hey, can y'all explain a tax home and the benefits at some point if the time allows? Much appreciated. So as we mentioned, we're not going to go into a lot of detail on this, Andy, because we've done numerous videos and articles specifically on tax homes, but just to give you a very brief overview, a tax home is more or less your permanent address, but there is more that goes into it than just your permanent address. It's really important to understand all the tax home rules and make sure you're meeting those requirements to qualify for tax-free stipends. This is not a rule that the hospital, the facility, the travel company, the recruiter set up. It's an IRS rule, which is why it's really important for you guys to understand this. I will link to some articles and videos specifically about tax homes.
Yeah, in general though, your tax home, in order to qualify for stipends, you need to be duplicating expenses. You need to be paying at a home location and at your travel assignment. Otherwise, there's no reason for them to give you tax-free stipends as a reimbursement if you're only paying expenses in one area. So that's the purpose of it. The majority of travelers are going to choose to have a tax home, because if not, all of your pay is taxed as a traveler and you make significantly less. So probably on the order of $300 to $400 to $500 less a week in some cases. So it depends on the job, but yeah, most travelers are going to have a tax home.
All right. Comment here from Braylon says they're a second year SPT or student physical therapist. Most definitely will be doing travel as a new grad. That's great, Braylon. We're so glad that you're already researching this now and learning now. It's super important to become well educated and well versed in all of this stuff, because it is quite different than getting into a permanent job as a new grad or a PRN job. So it's important to learn all this stuff in advance of starting traveling, and hopefully you'll be more well informed before you begin traveling. Let us know if you have any questions. Marcy said hello. Tyler said hello. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Nick. Let's see if there's any more questions before we wrap up tonight, guys. I'm saying tonight because I know on the mainland, as they say, the cool kids say, the mainland, it's nighttime. Here it's 2 p.m. and it's sunny.
And we're actually going to a travel therapy meetup here that we're hosting right after this. So it's just about happy hour here.
Yeah, we're hosting a travel therapist meetup with about 6 other travel therapists, travel PTs that are in the area. So that should be super exciting. We'll be posting about that on our Instagram and our Facebook page.
Just says, for travel PT, do you recommend looking into the compact PT license? Yeah, for sure. If your home state is part of the compact, then you're already eligible for it. There's not really that much that you need to do up front, but the compact just makes our life easier.
Absolutely. So it's super important, Aja, that you do research the compact license, but in terms of looking into it to try to get it, the most important factor here is you guys have to understand you're only eligible if your home state is participating.
And the way you know if it's your home state or not is look at your driver's license. If it's that state and it's part of the compact, that's what they look at. So if you were ever audited, which they do audit people, and if you file for compact privileges when you're not eligible, they can take away your license. So don't do that. And what they'll ask for is your driver's license. So if your home state, your driver's license state, is a compact state and you're licensed as a PT in that state, then you're eligible for the compact.
Yep. If not, you are not eligible. So don't mess around with that. If you are, for example, a California resident, you're not eligible. If you're in one of the other states that's not participating, you're not eligible. You can't fill out an application, get a license in another state. None of that matters. It matters if you have a driver's license and have a permanent address in that state.
But
now, if you want to move states, like you want to make Virginia, where we're from, your wonderful new home state, you want to get an apartment there and a driver's license there and then apply for the compact, go for it. But if you live in California or you live in one of the states that's not participating, you're not eligible.
There's like 30 states now though, so that's been wonderful. I mean, when we started, it didn't even exist. There was not even talks of it. So for new travelers, if you have a home state and a compact state, that's a really great thing.
It's a game changer for sure. So definitely good for us. Lauren says, thank you so much. I will fill out that form. Thank you, Lauren. Levi wants to know, did you have 401ks with multiple travel companies?
No. So we We would have, but we structured our travels in a way that we were able to max out our 401k with the same company each year when we were traveling back-to-back contracts. And basically the way we did that is we put the maximum amount possible for each paycheck into the 401k. So as long as we worked at least 2 contracts with that company, which it was our favorite company, so we worked the majority of our contracts with them. But if we worked 2 contracts in a year with that company, we were able to shovel enough money in to max it out. And that's the way we did it. So even if we worked 1 or 2 contracts with a different company, we just didn't sign up for their 401k and we only used that one company.
Yeah.
And you can do that. There's no problem with it. You can roll it over into your IRA when you're done. It just makes things a little bit more confusing, and we did our best to avoid that.
Yeah, so don't worry too much. Like if you switch companies, that is one reason some people choose not to switch companies, but there's a lot of benefits to keeping your options open to multiple companies. So it's not a huge deal if you do end up opening multiple 401ks. Like Jared said, you can eventually roll them all into one. It's just like transferring among a bank account with just a couple forms to fill out. So not a huge deal. The only thing to take into consideration is some of them don't let you contribute right away. So some of them you have to be on contract, like one whole contract, and then it's your second contract, your second 13 weeks that you're eligible to contribute. And that can be kind of a hassle, but yeah, not a huge deal if you do decide to sign up for more than one.
Ryan making Dustin Poirier comments. Conor McGregor.
Levi wants to know if you have articles on that topic. So we do have an
401k.
article.
Yep.
I don't know if we have one specifically about 401ks, but
we do.
We do have one about working with multiple companies and like how the benefits work.
We have one for 401ks.
Okay, we can link to that afterwards. Aja says, great, I'm from North Carolina. Perfect. North Carolina is part of the compact. Super great for you. Hopefully,
Nick thinks Michigan will be part of the compact by 2050. I'd say, yeah, probably a good chance of that.
I know. Well, hopefully we'll have like at least 75% of the states soon, but there's some holdouts like California. I don't know if they'll ever join.
Speech. So Gary says, does speech have compact states? Not yet. They are working on it though. We did a video, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, maybe a little bit longer, about all the different compacts. We talked about PT, OT, SLP. We can probably link to that video.
Yeah, go to the ASHA website, the American Speech and Hearing Association. They are working on their compact. I don't know if it has started yet. It could have started. I think it was supposed to start by later this year, but they definitely, ASHA or the Speech Association is a lot further along than the OT Association. The OT is still in the early stages. They said probably at the earliest, I want to say it was 2024.
Yeah.
So PT is in full effect. Speech is well on its way. OT is a little bit behind, unfortunately.
John says, I know that a lot of newer therapists seek travel therapy early in their career. Have you seen many therapists as they approach the final years of their career do this after kids are grown, etc.? Yeah, you're right. Most of the travelers are younger. If our followers are any indication, I mean, usually it's between the ages of like 25 and 30. But yes, there are probably, I would say, 5 to 10% of travelers that are later in their career, their kids are gone to college and they want to get out and explore more of the country. So yeah, there are definitely travelers that do that. Not as common. It really depends on you and your situation. Sometimes it can be a little bit more difficult getting reacquainted with a new facility, especially if you're a permanent therapist that has worked in the same place for a very long time and you're, really good with a certain documentation system and then you're having to transition into a brand new one. We've seen some travelers have trouble with that, but yeah, there's plenty of therapists that do it and they have great success with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have had a lot of therapists later in their careers reach out to us that want to do it as sort of like a stepping stone to full retirement, just take 1 or 2 travel contracts for fun. But just keep that in mind because we have experienced the documentation and like jumping into a new setting when you've been used to one for a long time as harder. So I think the more successful therapists are the ones that are pretty tech savvy with like different EMRs and the ones that have had experience in their career in multiple settings. So if you were already doing outpatient and doing home health like PRN or SNF and hospital and you have like more of a variety and you're used to kind of hopping around, you tend to do better than some therapists that have been in the same job in the same facility for 30 years.
Yep. Levi says, thanks. I started reading your blog last year during patient cancellations. Definitely appreciate your willingness to share what you have learned. Yeah, we just want others to not make the same mistakes we did. We made a ton of mistakes starting out. After Whitney's first contract, we were really considering if travel was really even for us, and it's really because we didn't go in with enough knowledge. And we don't want other people to go through the same situation we did.
Yeah, because back when we started in 2015, there wasn't a whole lot of information out there. So we're glad to bring this to you. Thanks for reading our articles, Levi. For those of you guys that are also thinking about getting started with travel, we've got over 100 articles on our website at traveltherapymentor.com. We've got over 100 videos we've done over the last several years on our Facebook page. I do put those on the website as well under videos. And we also recently launched a course. So if you don't have hundreds of hours to watch all of our videos and read every article we've ever written, we condense the primary knowledge that you need to know down into 12 hours of content in our course. So with the course title, we titled it Becoming a Financially Successful Travel Therapist. We combined everything that we know, everything that we think is important for you to know into 12 hours of video.
Which 12 hours is still a lot of time.
It is, but you can get through it in a weekend or a week or something, and it just tells you literally from A to Z, like, do these steps and you will be prepared to begin traveling. And we give you a lot of financial advice and tidbits on how, like, we become financially successful with our savings rate and being strategic with contracts, so that there's some travel therapists that don't come out ahead financially if they're not strategic. So if you are interested in kind of like fast tracking your way to learning about travel therapy, check out our course. It's on our website, traveltherapymentor.com/course. And if you do want to get a discount, we offer a discount code TRAVEL, and you can save $150 on the course.
Yep. All right, I think that's all the questions and comments. Thank you guys very much. If you have any future video recommendations, questions that you want us to cover, chances are we've already made a video on it, but some of those are a couple years old, so we can always go back and revisit some of those topics. Feel free to let us know, and we can always make videos on whatever you guys want to hear about.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining us, and thanks for those that will watch or listen on the replay. We hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.
Yep, take care.